Daniel Hayes waited until the last nurse stepped out of the room before he let go of Victoria Sterling's hand. Only seconds earlier, he'd looked like every grieving fiancé the hospital staff had been praying for. His eyes were red. His voice had cracked when he'd thanked the doctors. He hadn't left her bedside in 3 days. The door clicked shut. Daniel looked toward it, listening until the footsteps faded down the hallway. Then he smiled. "You always believed you could read people," he said quietly, brushing a strand of hair away from Victoria's face. "Funny how you never saw me." The door opened just enough for Samantha to slip inside. She glanced nervously at the bed. "Don't say things like that in here." Daniel barely looked at her. "Why? What if she can hear us?" He laughed under his breath. "She can't." Neither of them noticed the tiny tear that escaped from the corner of Victoria's closed eye, because the woman they believed had heard nothing for 3 days would remember every word for the rest of her life. "Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day." If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family. The room fell quiet again. Daniel slipped back into the chair beside Victoria's bed just as another nurse entered. His smile returned effortlessly. "Any change?" he asked. The nurse checked the monitor before gently shaking her head. "I'm afraid not." He nodded, looking down at Victoria as though he hadn't slept in days. "I'll keep waiting. You should get some rest." I made her a promise. The nurse offered him a sympathetic smile before quietly leaving. The moment the door closed, Daniel's expression disappeared. He picked up his phone and checked a message. "Board meeting confirmed. Richard attending." He locked the screen without reacting. From the hallway, someone was approaching. He knew the footsteps. Maggie, the elderly housekeeper, entered carrying fresh white lilies. She smiled softly when she saw Daniel. "These were delivered this morning. They're beautiful." She placed them beside the bed before looking at Victoria. "I keep telling her she'll get tired of everyone fussing over her." Daniel forced a tired chuckle. "I hope you get the chance." "So do I." For a moment, the room was silent. Maggie had worked for the Sterling family for nearly 30 years. She had watched Victoria grow from an awkward little girl into one of the most respected business leaders in the country. Looking at her now, connected to machines, unable to move, it didn't seem real. Maggie gently adjusted the blanket. "We'll all be here when you wake up." Daniel lowered his eyes. "So will I." Maggie nodded politely. "I know." She quietly left the room. As she reached the hallway, she glanced back through the small window in the door. Daniel was already looking at his phone again. She frowned for only a second before continuing toward the elevator. It wasn't suspicion. Not yet. Just something she couldn't quite explain. Long before hospitals became part of Victoria Sterling's life, people believed they knew exactly who she was. To the financial world, she was the young billionaire who had taken control of Sterling Global Holdings before turning 30. To business magazines, she was the CEO who kept appearing on lists of America's most influential women. To the thousands of people who worked for her, she was simply Victoria. She insisted on it. The first time a newly hired executive called her Ms. Sterling during a factory visit, she smiled and held out her hand. "It's Victoria." The executive looked uncertain. "I don't think the board would approve." Victoria laughed. "Good thing we're not talking to the board." Word spread quickly through the company. She remembered names. She asked about people's families. If someone retired after 30 years, she attended the farewell lunch even when her calendar said she didn't have time. None of it felt like a strategy. It was simply how she'd been raised. Her father used to tell her, if people only matter when the cameras are watching, then they never mattered at all. Her mother believed something similar. She never announced the families she helped. She simply helped them. Victoria inherited both lessons long before she inherited the company. Then, within 18 months, she lost both parents. One to a sudden heart attack. The other to an illness that moved far faster than anyone expected. Grief arrived before she had learned how to lead. Responsibility arrived before she had learned how to mourn. Many people expected the Sterling board to quietly replace her. Some investors openly questioned whether someone so young could protect a company built over 4 generations. Victoria never answered them publicly. She answered them by showing up. She spent her first year visiting every major Sterling facility, not for photographs, to listen. One winter morning in Ohio, she walked through a manufacturing plant before sunrise because the overnight shift had complained that no executive had ever bothered meeting them. At the end of the visit, one machine operator looked at her and laughed. "I thought billionaires slept in." Victoria smiled. "I tried." "And?" "My alarm clock ignored my bank account." The room burst into laughter. That became one of the most talked about visits in company history, not because of a speech, because people felt seen. Months later, when the company faced a difficult economic downturn, outside consultants recommended eliminating nearly 1,000 jobs. The spreadsheets made sense. Victoria stared at them for almost an hour. Then she pushed them aside. "What if we reduce executive bonuses instead?" The consultants exchanged uncertain looks. One finally answered, "Shareholders won't like it." Victoria nodded. "But families might." The decision cost the executive team millions. It protected nearly 1,000 paychecks. Years later, employees still remembered that meeting, not because it saved the company, because it reminded them what kind of leader they worked for. Victoria never asked people to be loyal. She simply gave them reasons to be. One of those people was Maggie. Neither of them knew it then. But that loyalty would one day become the difference between losing everything and getting her life back. 3 days into the fake coma, Victoria discovered something she hadn't expected. Betrayal wasn't the first thing that replayed in her mind. Love was. The real kind. The kind she'd believed she'd found. Lying motionless in that hospital bed, she kept asking herself the same question. When had everything changed? Because the Daniel she had fallen in love with didn't seem like the man whispering beside her hospital bed. 5 years earlier, Victoria had attended the annual Sterling Children's Health Foundation Gala. It was the one event she never missed. Not because she enjoyed formal dinners, because every dollar raised helped families who couldn't afford specialized treatment for their children. As always, she spent more time speaking with volunteers than donors. Near the end of the evening, she escaped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the city. For 10 peaceful seconds, no one asked about business. No one wanted a photograph. She finally exhaled. "Long night?" The voice startled her. She turned to find a man holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He smiled apologetically. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you." "You didn't. You looked like you needed a break." "I did." He offered her one of the glasses. "I figured water was safer than champagne." She laughed. "Why?" "Because everyone else has probably been offering champagne all night." She accepted it. "Good observation. I'm Daniel." "Victoria." "I know." She smiled. "I assumed you did." He nodded toward the ballroom. "Hard not to." And something unusual happened. He didn't ask about Sterling Global. He didn't compliment her success. He didn't mention her fortune. Instead, he nodded toward a little girl dancing with her father near the stage. "I think she's having more fun than everyone else combined." Victoria looked over. "I think you're right." For the next 20 minutes, they talked about everything except business. Books, travel, favorite diners, the terrible coffee served at charity galas. When someone interrupted to ask Victoria for a photograph, Daniel simply stepped aside and waited. He didn't try to join the picture. He didn't introduce himself to important people. He didn't try to impress anyone. When the evening ended, he smiled. "It was nice meeting you." "You too. I hope life is kind to you." She laughed. "That's a different goodbye. I got tired of saying, 'See you soon.'" "And?" "Most people never do." Victoria watched him disappear into the crowd. She realized something as she drove home. She had no idea what he did for a living. And, somehow, that felt refreshing. Over the next several months, they kept running into each other at a bookstore, a community fundraiser, a neighborhood coffee shop, once at a farmer's market where Daniel spent 10 minutes trying to convince an elderly vendor that she'd accidentally undercharged him. Victoria stood nearby smiling. "You know you could have walked away." "I could have, but she would have been short $20. He shrugged. "I would have noticed." Little moments like that slowly earned her trust, not because Daniel performed kindness, because he never seemed to notice when he was being kind. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria invited him to Sterling Manor for lunch. She warned him before he arrived. The house is much less impressive once you get inside. Daniel looked around the enormous entrance hall. "I'm not sure that's true." She laughed. "You'll see." Maggie welcomed him warmly. "You must be Daniel." "I hope that's a good thing." "It depends." She smiled mischievously. "Can you fix a leaking faucet?" Daniel looked at Victoria. "Is this part of the interview?" "It might be." He rolled up his sleeves. "Show me the faucet." 20 minutes later, he was lying on the kitchen floor, trying to stop water from spraying across the cabinets. Victoria laughed so hard she had to lean against the counter. Maggie handed Daniel another towel. "I've seen professionals do worse." "I'm choosing to believe that's encouragement." "It is." Eventually he fixed it. Mostly. The faucet still dripped every now and then. For weeks afterward, Maggie jokingly referred to it as Daniel's signature. As Daniel became part of Victoria's life, Sterling Manor slowly changed. The house sounded different. There was music in the kitchen again, movie nights in the library, long conversations on the back porch after dinner. Victoria smiled more. Even Richard noticed. During one board meeting, he quietly said, "You look happier." Victoria looked up from her notes. "I am." Richard smiled. "Good. You deserve uncomplicated happiness." She looked down at the engagement ring Daniel had recently given her. "So does he." Richard didn't answer. He simply hoped she was right. Daniel truly cared about Victoria. That part was real, which made everything that happened later so much more tragic. But there was another part of Daniel's life Victoria never fully saw. His parents. They had spent years watching other people build fortunes while believing their son deserved the same opportunities. When Daniel told them he was dating Victoria Sterling, his mother smiled. His father became unusually quiet. Later that evening, after dinner, his father poured 2 cups of coffee. "She's extraordinary." Daniel nodded. "She is." His father leaned back. "Do you love her?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes." His father looked satisfied. "Good." Then came the sentence Daniel would think about for years. "Just don't be foolish enough to walk away from a future most people spend their entire lives chasing." Daniel frowned. "I'm not with her because she's wealthy." "I believe you." His father stirred his coffee. "But eventually, you'll have to decide. What? Whether you're building a life together or inheriting one." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't like the conversation, but the words stayed with him. Long after the coffee had gone cold, 6 months later, Daniel proposed beneath the old oak tree on the grounds of Sterling Manor. It wasn't elaborate. No orchestra. No photographers hiding behind bushes. Just the 2 of them. "I had this whole speech planned," he admitted. Victoria smiled. "What happened to it?" "I saw you walking toward me. And I forgot every word." She laughed. "So, this is your proposal?" He dropped to one knee. "I love you. I know life won't always be easy. I know you'll always have responsibilities most people never understand." He looked into her eyes. "But if you let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life helping carry them." Victoria didn't answer immediately. Tears filled her eyes. Then she whispered, "Yes." From the kitchen window, Maggie watched quietly before stepping away. Some moments belonged only to the people living them. She smiled to herself. After so many lonely years, Victoria had finally found someone who seemed to love her for exactly who she was. Standing beneath that old oak tree, every single person who cared about Victoria believed the hardest part of her life was finally behind her. None of them knew. It was only just beginning. By the 4th day of Victoria's coma, Samantha had stopped looking at the monitors. Instead, she looked at Victoria. Not with anger, not even with jealousy, just regret. She stood at the foot of the hospital bed, twisting the strap of her handbag around her fingers. Daniel noticed. "You've been quiet. I don't think I should be here today." He frowned. "Why?" "Because every time I walk into this room—" She looked at Victoria. "I remember who she used to be." Daniel didn't answer. Outside the room, Maggie noticed Samantha wiping away tears before she left. It wasn't enough to make Maggie trust her, but it was enough to remind her that guilt and innocence didn't always wear different faces. Years earlier, long before boardrooms, billion-dollar decisions, and charity galas, Victoria and Samantha had been two little girls chasing butterflies across the gardens of Sterling Manor. Samantha's mother worked as the estate's florist. Every summer, she brought her daughter along while arranging flowers for family events. Victoria hated seeing Samantha sit alone while the adults worked, so she made a decision only children could make. "If you're here, then you're playing with me." From that day on, they became inseparable. They built imaginary kingdoms beneath the old maple tree, held tea parties for stuffed animals, argued over board games, promised they'd always stay best friends. When Samantha's family couldn't afford summer camp, Victoria convinced her parents to sponsor a staff family scholarship. Only years later did Samantha discover that the scholarship had been created just for her. Victoria had never mentioned it. As they grew older, their lives slowly began moving in different directions. Victoria inherited responsibilities. Samantha inherited comparisons. Teachers praised Victoria's intelligence. Business magazines celebrated her achievements. People constantly said things like, "Victoria is remarkable." Victoria never forgets a name. Victoria's going to change lives. Most people never realized what came next. They would turn toward Samantha and smile politely. "I'm sure you'll do well, too." They meant it kindly, but kindness wrapped around comparison still leaves a bruise. Victoria never noticed, not because she didn't care, because she genuinely believed they were equals. When Samantha graduated from college with honors, Victoria threw her a surprise celebration. When Samantha struggled to find work after graduation, Victoria introduced her to people she trusted, but never offered her a job inside Sterling Global. Richard once asked why. Victoria smiled. "Because I never want her wondering whether people respect her. Or my last name." Richard admired that answer. Victoria wanted Samantha to build something that belonged completely to her. She never realized Samantha sometimes wished she'd simply opened the door. As adults, they still met almost every Friday evening, sometimes at Sterling Manor, sometimes at a quiet Italian restaurant. Neither of them wanted to become famous. Their conversations rarely revolved around money. Instead, they talked about ordinary things: books, movies, recipes that had gone terribly wrong. When Daniel entered Victoria's life, Samantha welcomed him warmly. She genuinely wanted her friend to be happy. Daniel seemed different from the ambitious executives who usually surrounded Victoria. He listened more than he talked. He remembered birthdays. He laughed easily. Even Maggie liked him. For a while, so did Samantha. The first crack appeared so quietly that no one recognized it. One evening, Victoria was delayed at a board meeting. Daniel and Samantha waited together at a small restaurant. The waitress apologized. "I'm sorry she's running late." Daniel smiled. "She's trying to keep 5,000 employees working. I think we can wait." Samantha laughed. "That's the most Victoria answer I've ever heard from someone who isn't Victoria." Daniel smiled. "I guess some habits rub off." The conversation drifted naturally. Childhood stories, embarrassing first jobs, favorite music, nothing inappropriate, nothing secret, just two people passing time. When Victoria finally arrived almost an hour later, she apologized repeatedly. Daniel stood to hug her. "You don't have to apologize." Samantha smiled. "I already stole your fries anyway." Victoria laughed. "Then I definitely forgive both of you." It was an ordinary evening. No one thought about it again. Except Daniel and Samantha had discovered something unexpected. Talking to each other was easy. Over the following months, Small moments became more frequent. Victoria running late because of meetings. Daniel offering Samantha a ride home after dinner. A quick conversation while waiting for charity events to begin. None of it crossed obvious boundaries, at least not at first. But emotional boundaries are rarely crossed all at once. They disappear one comfortable conversation at a time. Then came the evening neither of them forgot. Victoria had flown to Chicago for an emergency meeting involving a Sterling manufacturing facility. Daniel called Samantha. "I've got 2 tickets to a jazz concert." There was a long pause. "I forgot Victoria was out of town." "So did I." Another silence. "We could sell them." "We could." Neither moved to end the call. Finally, Samantha sighed. "It would be a shame to waste them." The concert was wonderful. That wasn't the problem. The problem came afterward. They sat outside a late-night diner, talking long after midnight. No flirting, no touching, just honesty. Daniel admitted how lonely life sometimes felt dating one of the country's busiest CEOs. Samantha admitted she was tired of feeling like she measured herself against a friend who never intended to make anyone feel small. For the first time, they weren't talking about Victoria. They were talking through her. Someone eventually reached across the table. Neither of them remembered who moved first. Their hands touched. Both pulled away almost immediately. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Samantha stood first. "This can't happen again." Daniel nodded. "It won't." They left in separate cars. Neither spoke about that night again. But promises made after crossing a line are often weaker than the line itself, because once people discover a door exists, pretending they don't know where it is becomes much harder. And neither Daniel nor Samantha realized they had just opened the first door that would eventually destroy 3 lives. Victoria didn't become suspicious overnight. Looking back later, she realized that would have been easier. The truth arrived the way it usually does. Quietly, hidden inside ordinary days. Nearly a year after the engagement, life looked almost perfect from the outside. Wedding plans moved forward. Sterling Global continued expanding. Daniel had become a familiar face at charity events and company functions. Employees greeted him warmly. Maggie joked that he'd become part of the furniture at Sterling Manor. Victoria believed she'd finally found the balance she'd spent years searching for. A meaningful career, a loving relationship, a home that no longer felt lonely. If someone had told her then that everything was beginning to fall apart, she would have laughed. The first moment barely registered. Victoria was reviewing quarterly reports when a request appeared in her digital approval queue. Access request. Executive succession policies requested by Daniel Hayes. She frowned. When Daniel came home that evening, she asked casually, "I saw you requested access to some governance files." Daniel looked up from setting the table. "Oh, yeah. I've been trying to understand how everything works." Victoria smiled. "You planning to replace me already?" He laughed. "I couldn't survive your calendar." "Then why read succession policies?" He shrugged. "I figured if we're getting married, I should understand the company that's such a big part of your life." It sounded reasonable. Victoria nodded. "I'll have Richard send you the public governance summary. Most of those internal files are restricted." Daniel smiled. "Fair enough." The conversation ended there. So did Victoria's concern. A month later, another small moment appeared. She was leaving a board meeting when she noticed Samantha waiting outside her office. "You okay?" Samantha smiled. "I was. Then I got curious." "About?" Samantha pointed toward a framed photograph of Victoria's parents. "How does succession actually work?" Victoria laughed. "You're the second person who's asked me that this month." Samantha blinked. "Really?" Daniel asked almost the same thing. Samantha looked away for only a second. "Oh, I guess people wonder." Victoria smiled. "I suppose they do." She unlocked her office. "It's actually pretty boring. There are trusts, independent oversight, emergency procedures, more lawyers than anyone deserves." Samantha laughed. "I'm glad you explained it." "I still don't understand." Neither woman realized That wasn't really the point of the question. A few weeks later, Richard called Victoria after reviewing several expense reports. "I've got something odd." "What is it?" "There have been requests for copies of historical governance documents." Victoria looked puzzled. "From who?" "Daniel." She frowned. "I already told him those records weren't necessary." Richard remained calm. He didn't access them. He only requested them. Victoria leaned back in her chair. "Should I be worried?" "I don't know. It may be nothing. It probably is." Richard paused. "But I thought you should know." Victoria thanked him. After hanging up, she stared out the office window for almost 5 minutes. Then she closed the file. Daniel deserved trust, didn't he? That evening, she decided to ask him directly, not as a CEO, as his fiancé. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked up from chopping vegetables. "Of course. Why are you so interested in governance lately?" He stopped cutting, only for a second, then smiled. "I knew Richard called." "You did?" He looked at me strangely after our last meeting. Victoria laughed softly. "Richard looks at everyone strangely." "That's true." Daniel set the knife down. "I'll tell you the truth." She waited. "My parents?" "What about them?" "They keep reminding me that if we're getting married." "Oh, I should understand your responsibilities." Victoria nodded slowly. "They're not wrong." "I know. I just don't want you thinking I'm trying to interfere." She reached across the kitchen island and squeezed his hand. "I don't," and she meant it. Life moved on, until another small moment refused to let go. Victoria and Samantha were preparing for a charity auction when Samantha casually picked up a guest list. "So," she flipped through a few pages, "if something ever happened to you." Victoria looked up. "What?" Samantha smiled awkwardly. "I mean, who takes over Sterling Global?" Victoria laughed. "Why is everyone obsessed with me disappearing?" Samantha looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know." Victoria shook her head. "It's probably because the media writes those ridiculous succession articles." "Probably." The conversation shifted to table decorations. But later that night, Victoria remembered something. Neither Daniel nor Samantha had ever shown much interest in corporate governance before. Now both of them seemed unusually curious. Separately, months apart. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe. The following week, Victoria visited one of Sterling Global's regional offices. During lunch, she noticed something unusual. 2 department managers suddenly stopped talking when Daniel walked into the cafeteria. He smiled politely. They smiled back, but the conversation never resumed. That afternoon, Victoria quietly asked one of them, "Everything all right?" The manager hesitated. "Oh, yes, just discussing budgets." His answer came too quickly. She let it go, but another tiny question lodged itself in the back of her mind. That evening, Maggie found Victoria sitting alone on the back porch. "You've been out here a while." Victoria smiled faintly. "I needed some quiet." Maggie handed her a mug of tea. "You always come out here when something's bothering you." Victoria looked surprised. "Do I?" "For 20 years." Victoria laughed. "I guess I'm predictable." Maggie sat beside her. "You don't have to tell me." Victoria stared into the garden. "I'm probably imagining things." "Maybe. But imagination usually doesn't keep you awake." Victoria looked over. "What makes you say that?" Maggie smiled knowingly. "You've made 3 cups of tea today. You only do that when your mind won't sit still." Victoria laughed again, this time more softly. "I think I'm becoming paranoid." Maggie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the old oak tree where Daniel had proposed. Then she quietly said, "Trust is a beautiful thing." Victoria nodded. "It is." Maggie gently added, "But trust isn't the same as refusing to notice what's in front of you." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Those words stayed with her, long after the tea had gone cold. That night, lying beside Daniel as he slept peacefully, Victoria stared at the ceiling. Nothing had happened. No affair, no accusation, no evidence. Only questions. Small questions. Questions that, taken one at a time, seemed too insignificant to matter. But together, they were beginning to sound like a voice she could no longer ignore. Victoria waited another 2 weeks before mentioning her concerns again. She wasn't gathering evidence. She was trying to prove herself wrong. Every morning she woke up hoping she'd laugh at how much she'd overthought a few harmless conversations. Instead, the questions kept finding her. It started with a phone call from Richard. "Do you have a minute? I'm heading between meetings. This won't take long." His voice sounded unusually careful. I reviewed another batch of internal access requests. Victoria stopped walking. "Daniel?" "Yes." "What now?" "He requested archived trust amendments." Victoria frowned. "He doesn't even know those exist." That's what concerned me. She leaned against the hallway wall. "Did he get access?" "No, but someone has been telling him exactly what to ask for." That sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. That evening, Victoria didn't mention it. Instead, she watched. Daniel came home carrying takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant. He kissed her forehead, asked about her day, complained about traffic. Everything looked perfectly normal. Then, while they cleared the dinner plates, he spoke without looking at her. "Have you ever thought about taking a longer vacation?" She smiled. "You know me. I barely take weekends." "I know." He dried another plate. "But maybe you should." "Why now?" He shrugged. "You've been working too hard." It sounded thoughtful. It should have reassured her. Instead, it felt rehearsed. A few days later, Samantha invited Victoria to lunch. Halfway through the meal, Samantha looked unusually distracted. "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm just tired." Victoria smiled. "You've said that 3 times. Samantha laughed awkwardly. "I guess I have." They ordered dessert. Then, Samantha asked another strange question. If someone became temporarily unable to run Sterling Global. Victoria looked up. "Samantha." Her friend blinked. "What?" "That's the 3rd question you've asked me about the company in 2 months." Samantha looked genuinely embarrassed. "I didn't realize." Victoria studied her for a moment, then smiled. "I think Daniel's curiosity is contagious." For the briefest second, something flashed across Samantha's face. Not surprise, not amusement, relief. She quickly changed the subject. Victoria noticed. She said nothing. That night, she couldn't sleep. Daniel lay peacefully beside her. She slipped quietly out of bed and walked downstairs. Sterling Manor was completely still. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window. The lights from the guest house shimmered in the distance. Behind her, she heard soft footsteps. "Maggie, I thought I heard someone." Victoria smiled apologetically. "Sorry." "No apology needed." Maggie poured herself tea. "Your mother used to come down here when she couldn't sleep." Victoria smiled faintly. "I remember." She always said the kitchen felt honest after midnight. They stood together for a while. Finally, Maggie asked, "Is it work?" Victoria hesitated. "I don't know." "Daniel?" Victoria looked surprised. "What makes you say that?" Maggie stirred her tea slowly. "I've watched people for a long time. When someone stops sleeping, it's usually because their heart noticed something before their mind did." Victoria stared at the steam rising from her glass. "I don't have proof of anything. You don't need proof to ask questions. I don't want to become suspicious of everyone." Maggie gently smiled. "You won't. That's not who you are." The next morning, Victoria called Richard. "Can we meet somewhere private?" "Of course." Instead of meeting at Sterling Global, Richard suggested a quiet cafe nearly 40 minutes away. No executives, no employees, no familiar faces. When Victoria arrived, Richard already had 2 coffees waiting. "You look tired." "I am." She sat down. For several seconds, she simply stared at the table. Then she finally admitted it. "I think something's wrong." Richard didn't interrupt. I don't know what. I don't know if I'm imagining it. I don't even know whether it has anything to do with Daniel. She looked up. I don't feel safe ignoring it anymore. Richard nodded slowly. I'm glad you told me. She frowned. You're not going to tell me I'm overreacting? No. I'm going to tell you something your father used to say. Victoria smiled faintly. I've been hearing a lot of those lately. Richard smiled back. He used to say, facts don't insult honest people. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means if Daniel has done nothing wrong. The truth protects him. And if he hasn't? Richard held her gaze. The truth protects you. For the first time since all of this began, Victoria felt herself breathe normally again, not because she had answers, because she no longer felt alone. Over the following week, Richard quietly began reviewing records. He never accused anyone, never confronted Daniel, never alerted the board. He simply followed paperwork. Electronic access logs, legal requests, outside consultations, corporate governance inquiries. The deeper he looked, the more unusual the pattern became. Nothing illegal, not yet. But Daniel wasn't reading random company policies. Every request centered on one subject: executive incapacity. Richard called Dr. James Whitaker 2 evenings later. I need a favor. James chuckled. I don't like how serious that sounded. Richard didn't smile. I need your opinion. Medical? And confidential. They met after hours at James's private office. Richard explained everything. When he finished, James leaned back quietly. So, you think someone's preparing for Victoria to become unable to lead? I don't know. I know someone is preparing for that possibility. James folded his arms. And Victoria? She feels it. But she doesn't have evidence. James looked out the window. I've treated her for years. She doesn't imagine problems. No. Richard agreed. She ignores them. James nodded slowly. Then don't ignore this one. 3 days later, Richard returned to Sterling Global, carrying a thin folder. Inside were copies of every request Daniel had made over the previous 6 months. He placed them on Victoria's desk. She read them silently, then looked up. I never authorized any of this. I know. She turned another page, then another. Every request, every amendment, every inquiry, all pointing toward one possibility she still refused to believe. Victoria closed the folder. For a long time she said nothing. Finally, she looked at Richard. If we're right. Richard finished the sentence for her. We only get one chance to find out. Victoria slowly nodded. Outside her office window, employees hurried across the courtyard, completely unaware that the woman leading Sterling Global had just reached the most difficult decision of her life. Because whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. Victoria didn't make the decision that night, or the next. For nearly a week, she carried Richard's folder everywhere. It stayed inside her briefcase during board meetings, on the passenger seat while she drove home, on the dining table at Sterling Manor after dinner. She opened it dozens of times. Every time, she hoped she'd discover a simple explanation she'd somehow missed. She never did. Daniel noticed the change before anyone else, not because Victoria acted differently, because she became quieter. One evening, they were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. Normally, Victoria filled silences with small conversations. That night, she simply watched the trees sway in the breeze. Daniel glanced at her. You've been somewhere else all week. She smiled faintly. Work. You always say that. It usually happens to be true. He reached for her hand. When's the last time you took a day off? She looked at him. I don't remember. You should. She squeezed his hand. I will. Then she looked toward the old oak tree where he had proposed. For the first time, she wondered whether she truly knew the man sitting beside her. The thought frightened her, not because she believed it, because she didn't want to. The next morning, Victoria met Richard and Dr. James Whitaker in James's private office after normal business hours. No assistants, no board members, no records that could be casually discovered. James closed the door behind them. This meeting never happened. Richard nodded. Victoria looked at both men. I need someone to tell me I'm overreacting. Neither spoke. James finally broke the silence. If you asked me that a month ago, I would have tried. Victoria lowered her eyes. So where does that leave us? Richard answered quietly, with two possibilities. She looked up. Either Daniel is preparing for something that will never happen, or he's preparing for something he hopes will. The room fell silent. Victoria stood and walked toward the window. Traffic moved below. People hurried home from work. Ordinary lives. Ordinary evenings. She envied them. I don't want to accuse him. Richard nodded. Then don't. I don't want to destroy my relationship because of suspicion. You shouldn't. James folded his hands. But you also can't ignore a pattern that's becoming more specific every month. Victoria turned back toward them. So, what do I do? Richard answered without hesitation. Find the truth. She let out a slow breath. And if the truth destroys everything? Richard looked at her with the same calm expression he'd worn for nearly 20 years. Then it wasn't you who destroyed it. Nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, James leaned forward. I've been thinking about one thing. Victoria looked at him. If Daniel believes you're watching him, he'll become careful. Richard nodded. He'll stop making mistakes. James continued. But if he believes you've become completely unable to stop him, or he'll reveal exactly who he is. Victoria understood immediately. The room grew very quiet. You can't be serious. James didn't answer. Richard did. I think he is. Victoria looked from one man to the other. You want me to disappear? For a short time. James corrected her. We want everyone to believe you're unable to make decisions. She stared at them. A fake coma? Neither answered. They didn't need to. Victoria laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. James smiled slightly. Yes, which is exactly why no one would suspect it. She sat back down slowly. The risks? James immediately listed them. The medication, the emotional strain, the physical limitations, the psychological impact. You'll hear conversations you can never unhear. Victoria looked at him. I already know that. No. James's voice softened. You don't. Richard quietly placed another folder on the table. Inside was a legal strategy, medical protocols, emergency procedures, security plans. Every page had been prepared over the previous 48 hours. Victoria frowned. You already planned this. Richard answered honestly. I hoped you'd never need it. For nearly an hour, they examined every possibility. What if Daniel did nothing? What if they were completely wrong? What if the deception became public? What if Victoria suffered medical complications? Every concern was discussed. Every risk challenged. No one tried to convince Victoria. The decision remained hers alone. Finally, she closed the folder. I have one condition. Richard looked up. Name it. If this proves Daniel is innocent. He never finds out we suspected him. Richard nodded immediately. Agreed. James answered just as quickly. Absolutely. Victoria looked down at the engagement ring on her hand. She slowly removed it. Not because the engagement was over, because she suddenly realized the woman who put it on no longer existed. 2 days later, Victoria announced she would be traveling alone to inspect one of Sterling Global's renewable energy facilities outside the city. The trip wasn't unusual. She often drove herself to smaller sites without a large security team. Daniel kissed her goodbye that morning. Be careful. She smiled. I always am. He watched her drive away. It was the last time either of them would speak as two people who still believed they shared the same future. Late that afternoon, Richard received the phone call. A company vehicle had been involved in a serious accident after swerving to avoid an oncoming truck during heavy rain. Victoria was alive, but critically injured. The news spread through Sterling Global within minutes. Daniel arrived at the hospital looking genuinely devastated. He pushed past reporters, ignored television cameras, demanded to see her. James met him outside the intensive care unit. "She's alive." Daniel closed his eyes in relief. "But..." James hesitated. "We've placed her in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling and give her brain the best chance to recover." Daniel leaned against the wall as if his legs had given out. "When will she wake up?" James looked down. "We don't know." Daniel covered his face with both hands. Across the hallway, Samantha stood frozen. The color drained from her face. Neither of them noticed Richard watching quietly from the far end of the corridor. His attention wasn't on their tears. It was on what would happen after them. That night, as machines beeped softly around her, Victoria lay perfectly still. The medication made her body heavy. Her eyelids refused to open. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to sit up, to end the nightmare before it truly began. Instead, she remembered the promise she had made in James's office. Find the truth. Hours later, the hospital room door opened. Someone walked inside. Victoria recognized the footsteps immediately. "Daniel." He gently took her hand. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely rose above a whisper, he said, "I hope I'm wrong about what happens next." Victoria's heart tightened, because she no longer knew whether that sentence came from the man she loved, or the man she was about to discover. Victoria discovered something strange about silence. People think silence means nothing is happening. They were wrong. Silence made people careless. The first day after the accident, Daniel barely left her side. Friends visited. Board members came. Employees filled the room with flowers and handwritten cards. Every person who walked through the door saw the same picture. A heartbroken fiancé. He held Victoria's hand. He thanked every nurse. He looked exhausted. One elderly board member quietly told Richard, "If she pulls through, she'll never have to wonder how much that young man loves her." Richard looked through the glass toward Daniel, then simply answered, "I hope you're right." Victoria listened to every word. She wished she couldn't. Late that afternoon, the last visitor finally left. A nurse adjusted the four-pump. "I'll be back in about 30 minutes. Daniel smiled gratefully. "Thank you." The door closed. The room became quiet again. Victoria waited. She counted the seconds in her mind. 1, 2, 3. Then she heard the visitor's chair slide backward. Daniel stood. He walked to the window, looked into the hallway, then slowly closed the room door. Not locked, just closed. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. For almost a minute. He didn't say anything. Then he let out a slow breath. "I didn't think it would happen like this." His voice sounded completely different. Not cruel, not grieving, just relieved. Victoria's chest tightened. Another knock. 3 soft taps. Daniel opened the door. Samantha slipped inside. She looked pale. "Were you followed?" Daniel frowned. "We're not spies." "I know." She glanced toward Victoria. "I still don't like coming here." "You have to." She shook her head. "No, I don't." He quietly closed the door again. Neither of them looked at Victoria for very long. People rarely stare at someone they believe can't see them. Instead, they talk to each other, almost casually, like two people discussing unfinished business. Samantha spoke first. "I haven't slept." Daniel leaned against the wall. "Neither have I. This doesn't feel real." "It is." She looked at Victoria. "I keep expecting her to sit up." Daniel answered immediately. "She won't." The certainty in his voice chilled Victoria more than the hospital room ever could. Samantha rubbed her arms. "I hate being here." "You'll get used to it." "I don't want to." Daniel looked at her. "We've come too far." Those 5 words echoed inside Victoria's mind. "We've come too far. Too far. For what?" Samantha lowered her voice. "What happens if she wakes up?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, He picked up one of the sympathy cards lying beside the bed. He turned it over absent-mindedly. Then he quietly said, "We'll deal with it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Victoria noticed something unexpected. Samantha wasn't acting confident. She was frightened. Daniel wasn't. That difference mattered. Samantha looked down at the engagement ring still resting on Victoria's hand. "I can't even look at it." Daniel followed her gaze. "You don't have to. You make it sound so easy." "It isn't." She laughed bitterly. "It looks pretty easy for you." Daniel finally looked directly at Victoria. His expression hardened. "I spent years building a future. I'm not throwing everything away now." Victoria felt the words more than she heard them, not because of what they meant, because he said future, not her. Samantha took a slow breath. "Sometimes I wonder." She stopped. Daniel looked at her. "What? If we would have ended this before. If she hadn't trusted us so much." Daniel didn't answer. For a long moment, the room stayed silent. Then he quietly said, "Trust made this possible." Victoria felt tears gathering beneath her closed eyes. She couldn't wipe them away. Outside the room, footsteps approached. Daniel heard them first. His entire posture changed. Almost instantly, he sat back in the chair, reached for Victoria's hand, lowered his head. The perfect fiancé returned. The door opened. Dr. James Whittaker stepped inside carrying a chart. "Everything all right?" Daniel looked up, his eyes suddenly tired again. "I was talking to her." James smiled gently. Families often do. He began checking the monitors. While pretending to read Victoria's chart, he noticed something almost invisible. Her heart rate had climbed, only slightly. Anyone else would have dismissed it. James knew better. She had heard something. After Samantha left, James leaned close while pretending to adjust an IV line. His voice barely moved. "You don't have to hold on forever." A pause. Just long enough. Victoria wanted to cry. Instead, she lay perfectly still. That evening Richard visited after board meetings had ended. Daniel met him outside the room. "They're asking about temporary leadership." Richard nodded. "I expected that. I told them nothing matters except Victoria." Richard studied him carefully. "I'm glad to hear that." Daniel smiled sadly. "I love her." Richard held his gaze for a moment longer, then quietly answered, "I hope every decision you make reflects those words." Daniel didn't understand why that sentence unsettled him. Richard stepped into the room after Daniel walked away. James quietly closed the door behind him. "She heard something." James nodded once. "I think today was the first crack." Richard looked at Victoria. His voice remained calm. "Then we stay patient." James looked at the monitor. "How long?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Until they stop pretending." Neither man realized. That moment would come much sooner than either of them expected, because somewhere else in the hospital, Maggie had just stepped off the elevator carrying fresh flowers, and before the day ended, she was about to hear a conversation that would change everything. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the hospital carrying a fresh bouquet of white lilies. Victoria always preferred lilies over expensive arrangements. "They last longer," she used to say, "and they don't try so hard to impress anyone." Maggie smiled at the memory as she stepped off the elevator. Some habits survived even heartbreak. Victoria heard Maggie's familiar voice before she entered the room. "Good morning." The nurse smiled. "She's lucky to have so many people visiting." Maggie looked through the small window in the door. "No, we're the lucky ones." She spent her whole life showing up for everyone else. "It's our turn now." Victoria felt her throat tighten. If she could have opened her eyes in that moment, she would have. Inside the room, Maggie quietly replaced the flowers. She straightened the blanket, brushed a loose strand of hair away from Victoria's forehead and whispered, "You rest. We'll take care of everything else." Daniel stood nearby. He smiled warmly. "She always listens to you." Maggie laughed softly. She always pretended not to. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. I need to take this. I'll be outside. He stepped into the hallway. Maggie stayed another minute before deciding to leave. As she walked toward the elevator, she realized she'd forgotten her reading glasses on the windowsill inside Victoria's room. She sighed. Getting old. Turning around, she headed back. The hallway was empty. She reached the corner just as she heard voices coming from the small family consultation room across from Victoria's suite. Daniel and Samantha. The door wasn't completely closed. She had no intention of listening. She simply wanted her glasses. Then she heard Samantha say, I don't think I can keep pretending. Maggie's footsteps stopped. Daniel answered calmly, You don't have a choice. I know what we agreed. Samantha's voice shook, but sitting beside her, I feel like she's looking at me. Daniel sighed. She's in a coma. I know, but it doesn't feel like it. Maggie frowned. Something about the conversation didn't sound like grief. It sounded like fear. She quietly stepped back into the shadow of the hallway, not to spy, to avoid interrupting. The conversation continued. Samantha lowered her voice. What if Richard refuses to sign? Daniel gave a short laugh. He won't. How can you be so sure? Because the company can't function forever without someone making decisions. Richard knows that. And once temporary authority is approved, everything starts moving. Maggie's heart began beating faster. Temporary authority? Samantha looked toward the hospital room. I still think we're moving too fast. Daniel folded his arms. We've already waited long enough. For what? She stared at him. For Victoria to disappear? He looked away. For life to move forward. Those words hit Maggie like ice water. Samantha whispered, Don't say it like that. Why not? Because it sounds horrible. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I'm tired. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of crying for people. I'm tired of answering reporters. I want this finished. Maggie closed her eyes. The kindness she'd always seen in Daniel suddenly felt like a mask she'd never questioned. Samantha sank into a chair. What if she wakes up tomorrow? Daniel didn't hesitate. Then we adapt. And if she remembers something, he looked at her. She won't. How do you know? Because there's nothing to remember. Maggie felt a chill run through her. He wasn't speaking like a man hoping for recovery. He was speaking like someone managing a problem. The room fell quiet. Then Samantha asked the question that changed everything. Do you think she ever suspected us? Daniel answered after a long pause. No. A faint smile crossed his face. Victoria trusted people. That was always her greatest strength. He looked down at the floor. And her greatest weakness. Maggie pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself. She suddenly understood why nothing about the past few weeks had felt right. Inside the room, Samantha began crying. I never wanted it to become this. Daniel's voice softened. I know. I loved her too. Maggie frowned. Too? Daniel continued. But loving someone doesn't stop life from changing. Samantha shook her head. No. It was greed. It was jealousy. It was us. Daniel didn't answer. Silence filled the room. And somehow, his silence sounded more guilty than any confession. A nurse pushed a medication cart into the hallway. Maggie quickly stepped away before anyone noticed where she had been standing. She walked calmly toward Victoria's room, picked up her reading glasses, smiled politely at the nurse, then headed for the elevator. Only after the doors closed did she finally let herself breathe. Her hands were trembling, not because she had heard every detail, because she had heard enough. She drove straight to Sterling Global, not home, not back to Sterling Manor, straight to Richard's office. His assistant looked surprised. Mrs. Bennett, is Mr. Lawson available? Let me check. A moment later, Richard opened the door himself. One look at Maggie's face told him something had happened. He quietly closed the office door behind them. What is it? Maggie sat down slowly. I think. She struggled to steady her voice. "I think Daniel and Samantha aren't afraid of losing Victoria." She looked directly into Richard's eyes. "I think they're waiting for her not to come back." Richard didn't look surprised. He looked concerned. "What exactly did you hear?" Maggie repeated every sentence she could remember. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't speculate. She simply repeated their words. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finally finished, he walked to the office window. For nearly 30 seconds, he said nothing. Then he turned back toward her. "Maggie, what I'm about to tell you is the reason I need you to stay calm." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard lowered his voice. "The doctors didn't tell Daniel the whole truth." Maggie stared at him. "What truth?" Richard held her gaze. "Victoria isn't unconscious." The room became perfectly still. Maggie blinked. "I'm sorry." "I don't understand." Richard nodded slowly. "She hears everything." Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, my God!" A tear rolled down her cheek. "She's heard all of it?" Richard answered quietly. "Every single word." Maggie closed her eyes, then whispered the only thing she could think of. "She must feel so alone." Richard gently shook his head. "No." He looked directly at Maggie. "Not anymore." Because, from that moment forward, Victoria wasn't facing Daniel and Samantha by herself. She finally had someone inside Sterling Manor who knew the truth, and together, they were about to give Daniel all the confidence he needed to destroy himself. Maggie didn't go back to Sterling Manor that afternoon. She stayed in Richard's office, not because she had more to say, because she couldn't stop thinking about Victoria. The thought haunted her. Every cruel sentence, every whispered conversation, every moment Daniel believed he was alone. Victoria had heard it all. Richard poured her a cup of tea. She barely touched it. "I keep thinking about her lying there." He nodded quietly. "So do I." Maggie looked up. "How has she survived it?" Richard gave a sad smile. "1 hour at a time." For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Maggie asked the question that mattered most. "What do you need me to do?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Nothing different." She looked confused. "What?" "Go back to work. Act normally. Treat Daniel exactly the way you've always treated him. And if he says something, you remember it. If he asks questions, you answer only what you normally would. No traps. No confrontations. We don't need him scared. We need him comfortable." Maggie slowly nodded. "I understand." That evening, she returned to Sterling Manor. The house felt unusually quiet. Daniel was sitting alone in the library with a stack of legal papers spread across the coffee table. He looked up when Maggie walked in. "There you are. I was beginning to wonder if you'd taken the day off." Maggie smiled gently. "I wish." He chuckled. "I have a favor." "What is it?" He held up a folder. "I'm trying to understand some of Victoria's old company documents. Would Richard keep copies at the house?" Maggie answered exactly as she normally would. "I wouldn't know. You've worked here 30 years. I've cleaned every room." She smiled politely. "I've never read anyone's paperwork." Daniel laughed. "Fair enough." He looked back down at the documents. Maggie quietly continued dusting the bookshelves. Without realizing it, Daniel had just confirmed something else. The next morning, Richard met privately with Sterling Global's head of corporate security. The man had worked for the company for almost 25 years. He had protected Victoria's father before protecting Victoria. Richard placed several folders on the table. "I need to know exactly what Daniel has been accessing." The security director adjusted his glasses. "You think it's reached that point?" Richard answered calmly. "I think we're past it." They began reviewing electronic records, building access, computer logins, document requests, visitor records. One pattern immediately stood out. Daniel had entered Victoria's executive office 12 times over the previous 6 weeks. Almost every visit happened after normal business hours. Richard frowned. He never told anyone? The security director shook his head. He used his visitor authorization. Perfectly legal, but unusual. What was he opening? The security director clicked another report. Mostly governance files. Richard kept reading. Then another entry caught his eye. Victoria Sterling, Executive Trust Archive. Requested 4 separate times. Access denied. He looked up. He kept trying. The security director nodded. And someone kept telling him those files existed. Richard closed the folder. Daniel wasn't acting on impulse anymore. He was following a plan. The only question left was how far he intended to take it. Meanwhile, Samantha was falling apart. She barely slept. Food had started losing its taste. Even ordinary conversations exhausted her. One afternoon she arrived at Sterling Manor carrying homemade soup for Maggie. "I thought you might like this." Maggie smiled warmly. "That's thoughtful." Samantha forced a smile. "I'm trying." As Maggie thanked her, Samantha's eyes wandered toward the staircase, toward Victoria's bedroom. The room had remained untouched since the accident. "You still haven't moved anything." Maggie looked up. "No. Why would we?" Samantha swallowed. "I don't know. I guess." "Because it hurts." Maggie answered softly. "It would hurt more if she came home." And discovered we'd already erased her. Samantha looked away. She couldn't answer. As Samantha walked toward the front door, Maggie quietly called after her. "Miss Samantha?" She turned. "Yes?" Maggie smiled kindly. "She always loved you." Samantha's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I know." "No," Maggie gently corrected. "I don't think you do." Samantha left without another word. From the front window, Maggie watched her sit inside her car for nearly 10 minutes before driving away. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't acting like someone who had won. She looked like someone trapped inside her own decisions. Across town, Daniel's confidence was moving in the opposite direction. Every day that passed without Victoria waking up made him a little bolder. He stopped asking vague questions. He started making requests. Another meeting with Richard. Another draft of temporary governance documents. Another attempt to accelerate board discussions. Richard never argued. He simply listened, asked careful questions, made Daniel explain every decision. Every explanation became another piece of evidence. Late Friday afternoon, Daniel walked into Richard's office carrying a leather portfolio. "I think we're ready." Richard looked up. "Ready for what?" "The temporary authority paperwork." Richard accepted the folder. "I'll review it." Daniel smiled confidently. "I've already had 3 attorneys look at it." Richard raised an eyebrow. 3? I wanted to make sure everything was correct." Richard slowly nodded. "I appreciate thoroughness." Daniel relaxed. He believed the hardest part was over. He had no idea Richard had already arranged an independent forensic review of every document in the folder. That evening, Richard called Dr. James Whitaker. "We're close." James understood immediately. "How close?" "I think Daniel believes he's already won." James looked toward Victoria's room through the observation window. "Then we don't have much longer." "No," Richard agreed. "We don't." James lowered his voice. "Can she hold on?" Richard looked through the glass as Victoria lay perfectly still. "I don't know, but she won't have to for much longer." Before leaving for the night, James entered Victoria's room alone. He adjusted the blanket, checked her pulse, then leaned close enough for only her to hear. "We're almost there." A single tear slipped from the corner of Victoria's eye. James gently wiped it away before anyone else could see. "You've been stronger than anyone should ever have to be." He paused. "Tomorrow, everything changes." Outside the room, Daniel was already walking toward the elevator with a quiet smile. He believed tomorrow would finally give him control of Sterling Global. He never imagined tomorrow was actually the day he would lose everything. The next morning, Daniel woke up believing the hardest part was over. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. For the first time since Victoria's accident, he looked rested, not because he had finally made peace with what had happened, because he believed the future was finally beginning. His phone vibrated. Richard Lawson, 10:000 a.m., conference room, B, final governance review. Daniel smiled. This is it. From the bedroom doorway, Samantha watched him quietly. You look happy. Daniel picked up his briefcase. I look relieved. She folded her arms. Those aren't the same thing. He didn't answer. She walked closer. I had a dream about Victoria. Daniel sighed. Sam. No. Listen. In the dream. She was standing in sterling manner. She didn't say anything. She just looked at us. Daniel gently took her hands. You're exhausted. I'm guilty. They're different. She looked into his eyes. What if we're making a mistake? Daniel's expression hardened. We crossed that bridge months ago. You can't suddenly decide to become innocent. The words hit Samantha harder than he intended. She slowly pulled her hands away. For the first time, she realized Daniel no longer spoke like the man she'd once known. Everything had become strategy. Everything had become survival. At Sterling Global, Richard arrived almost an hour early. The conference room looked completely ordinary. Coffee, water, legal folders, nothing unusual. That was intentional. He didn't want Daniel walking into an interrogation. He wanted him walking into what he believed was another routine meeting. The security director stepped inside. Everything's ready. Richard nodded. The recording system? Active. The witnesses? They'll stay in the adjoining room until you call. Richard looked around one last time. No surprises. No pressure. We simply let him talk. At exactly 10 o'clock, Daniel walked into conference room B. Morning. Richard smiled. Good morning. Daniel sat down. I brought the revised documents. I assumed you would. Richard accepted the folder without opening it. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee. No rush. Daniel laughed. I don't remember the last time you said that. Richard smiled politely. Today's important. I'd rather we think than hurry. For nearly 15 minutes, they talked about everything except the documents, the markets, a recent acquisition, Victoria's employee scholarship program. Daniel gradually relaxed. This felt familiar, comfortable, exactly the way Richard wanted it to feel. Finally, Richard opened the folder. I've got a few questions. Daniel nodded confidently. Go ahead. The emergency governance clause. You requested an expansion. I did. Why? Daniel answered smoothly. The company needs flexibility. Richard nodded. And the succession amendments? They simplify decision-making. You wrote that language yourself? My attorneys helped. So, you approved every change? Yes. Richard made a quiet note, then asked another question. When did Victoria authorize these discussions? Daniel didn't hesitate. Several months ago. Verbally? Yes. In writing? Daniel smiled. She trusted me. Richard looked down at the paper. So, there's no written authorization. No, but she intended. Richard gently interrupted. I'm only asking what exists. Daniel nodded. No. Richard gently interrupted. I'm only asking what exists. Daniel nodded. No. The questions continued. Each one sounded harmless. Each answer quietly removed another layer of Daniel's protection. He never realized it. Because Richard never challenged him. He simply let him explain. Nearly 40 minutes later, Daniel leaned back comfortably. I think we've covered everything. I think so too. Richard closed the folder, then asked one final question. If Victoria recovered tomorrow, would you still believe these changes were necessary? Daniel laughed softly. Well, obviously not. Richard tilted his head. Why not? Because she'd be back. And the authority? Daniel shrugged. It would return to her. Richard nodded slowly. So these documents only matter if Victoria can't lead. Daniel answered, without thinking. Exactly. The room fell silent. Richard looked at him for several seconds, then quietly closed the folder. Thank you. Daniel smiled. For what? For answering honestly. Richard stood. He walked to the conference room door, then opened it. 5 people entered. The independent forensic accountant, 2 outside corporate attorneys, Sterling Global's security director, and the chairman of the board. Daniel's smile disappeared. What is this? Richard calmly answered, the rest of the meeting. Daniel looked around the room. No one told me there'd be witnesses. Richard handed him a printed copy of the meeting notice. Near the bottom, one sentence had been highlighted. Corporate governance proceedings may include independent observers. Daniel stared at his own signature beneath the acknowledgement. He had signed it the previous afternoon without reading it. His stomach tightened. Richard placed another folder in front of him. This contains every governance request you've submitted over the past 7 months. Another folder, electronic access records. Another, outside legal consultations. Another, document comparison reports. Daniel looked from one folder to the next. His breathing slowed. Not from calm, from shock. The forensic accountant quietly spoke. Several governance amendments contain language that does not appear in Sterling Global's approved legal templates. One attorney added, and some statements made during today's meeting directly contradict previous legal submissions. Daniel looked at Richard. You've been investigating me. Richard answered honestly, no. I've been protecting Victoria. No one raised their voice. No one accused Daniel of a crime. They simply placed facts on the table, one after another. Daniel suddenly realized something terrifying. He had done almost all of the talking. Richard glanced at his watch, then closed the final folder. I think we're finished here. Daniel swallowed. Finished? Richard nodded. There's only one conversation left. Daniel frowned. What conversation? Richard met his eyes. The one you've been certain could never happen. Daniel felt a chill move through him. He couldn't explain why. Richard picked up his briefcase. Come with me. Where? Richard answered quietly. To see Victoria. For the first time since the accident, Daniel hesitated, because something deep inside him finally whispered that he wasn't walking toward another meeting. He was walking toward the truth. Daniel followed Richard out of Sterling Global without asking another question. The drive to the hospital felt unusually quiet. Normally, Daniel filled silence with conversation. Today, he watched the city pass through the passenger window. Every few minutes, he caught Richard glancing at him, not with anger, with disappointment. That bothered him more than accusation would have. At the hospital, Samantha was already waiting. The moment she saw Daniel, she knew something had gone wrong. How was the meeting? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He loosened his tie. There were lawyers. Her face tightened. What kind of lawyers? Outside counsel. And? They asked questions. What questions? The kind I wasn't expecting. Samantha's heartbeat quickened. Did you answer them? I had to. She looked around the waiting room before lowering her voice. Daniel. I don't think this is working anymore. He looked at her. It has to. No, it doesn't. I can't keep walking into her room pretending everything's normal. Daniel rubbed his forehead. We're almost through this. Samantha slowly shook her head. I don't think we are. Neither of them noticed Maggie walking toward the nurse's station carrying a fresh vase of flowers. She wasn't trying to overhear them, but as she rounded the corner, Daniel's next sentence stopped her. One more day. He looked directly at Samantha. After today, everything changes. Maggie remained where she was. Something in Daniel's voice no longer sounded hopeful. It sounded confident, far too confident. Samantha looked toward Victoria's room. I wish we could go back. Daniel frowned. To what? Before all of this. He gave a tired laugh. That's not how life works. No, she whispered. It's how regret works. Daniel looked away. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. Maggie quietly continued walking. Her expression never changed. She placed the flowers inside Victoria's room, smiled warmly at the nurses, then stepped back into the hallway. A few moments later, Richard arrived. Their eyes met. He didn't need to ask. Maggie gave the smallest nod. Richard understood immediately. Daniel was still talking, still convinced no one could hear him. Exactly what they needed. Richard approached Daniel. "Could I borrow you for a minute?" Daniel looked surprised. "Of course." They stepped into an empty consultation room. Richard closed the door. "I have one question." Daniel folded his arms. "Go ahead." "Have you told Samantha everything?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everything." Daniel held his gaze. "Yes." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I hope that's true." Daniel frowned even more. "What is this about?" Richard smiled politely. "You'll understand soon." He opened the door and walked out. Daniel stood alone for several seconds. Something about that conversation unsettled him. Richard wasn't fishing. He already knew something. Daniel simply couldn't figure out what. Meanwhile, Samantha wandered into the hospital chapel. The room was empty. She sat in the last pew and stared at the stained glass window above the altar. She hadn't prayed in years. She wasn't even sure she remembered how. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know who I'm talking to. But if Victoria wakes up..." She stopped because she didn't know how to finish the sentence. Let her forgive me. She hadn't earned forgiveness. Let her hate me. She'd already hated herself enough for both of them. A quiet sob escaped before she covered her face. For the first time, she admitted the truth she'd been avoiding. She hadn't fallen in love with Daniel. She had fallen into loneliness, then into comparison, then into secrecy. By the time she realized the difference, she no longer recognized herself. Back in Victoria's room, Dr. James Whitaker completed another examination. The monitors looked strong. Her neurological responses remained exactly where he expected them. He leaned close enough that only Victoria could hear. "It's almost over." A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. James gently wiped it away. I know. He stepped back as Maggie entered. The elderly housekeeper quietly placed another bouquet beside the bed. Then she leaned down and whispered, "You don't have to be brave by yourself anymore." Victoria couldn't move, but inside, something finally relaxed. For days, she'd carried the weight of betrayal alone. Now she knew Maggie knew. Richard knew. James knew. She wasn't fighting by herself anymore. An hour later, Richard gathered everyone in the hospital's private family conference room. Daniel arrived first. Samantha followed a few moments later. James entered with the hospital's legal administrator. Then, 2 independent attorneys. Finally, Maggie walked in quietly and took a seat near the back. Daniel looked around. His patience disappeared. "Can someone tell me what's going on?" Richard remained standing. "I will." Daniel frowned. "Then tell me." Richard looked around the room before speaking. "Before we discuss anything else, there's someone here whose voice deserves to be heard." He turned toward Maggie. She looked startled. "Me?" Richard nodded. "Yes." Maggie slowly stood. She had spoken to thousands of people during her lifetime. Children, employees, neighbors, friends. Yet this felt like the hardest conversation she'd ever had. She looked directly at Daniel. "I always believed you loved her." Daniel's expression softened. "I do." Maggie gently shook her head. "I believed that too." The room became very quiet. "Then I heard you." Daniel froze. "What?" "I heard you." She looked at Samantha. "I heard both of you." Samantha's face went completely pale. Daniel forced a small laugh. "You must have misunderstood." "I hoped I had." Maggie's voice never rose. "I spent an entire night praying I'd misunderstood." She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "But I didn't." Daniel glanced at Richard. "This is ridiculous." "No," Richard answered calmly. "It isn't." He placed a thin folder on the table. "Maggie's statement matches your own timeline." Another folder. "It matches your document requests." Another. It matches your conversations with the board. Daniel stared silently. Richard took one slow breath. We're finished collecting evidence. We're here because there's only one truth left that matters. Daniel looked confused. What truth? Before Richard could answer, the conference room door opened. Dr. Whitaker looked around the room, then calmly said, "She's asking for you." Daniel's heart stopped. What? James held his gaze. Victoria, she's awake. The room fell into stunned silence. Daniel's mouth opened. No words came out. Samantha stumbled backward until she caught herself against the wall. Maggie quietly closed her eyes. Not because she was surprised, because after days of silence, the woman they thought would never speak again was finally ready to tell them exactly what she had heard. No one moved. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the conference room was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Daniel looked from Dr. Whitaker to Richard, then back again. I'm sorry. I don't understand. Dr. Whitaker remained calm. Victoria regained consciousness a short while ago. Daniel's face drained of color. When? Just recently. James deliberately kept his answer vague. There was no reason to tell Daniel the truth yet. Richard picked up the folders from the table. I think she deserves to speak before anyone else does. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it actually was. Nobody spoke. Samantha walked several steps behind everyone else. Her breathing had become shallow. Twice, she almost turned around. Twice, she forced herself to keep walking. Maggie quietly reached over and squeezed her hand. Not out of forgiveness, out of humanity. Samantha immediately began crying. Outside Victoria's room, James stopped everyone. Are a few things you need to remember. He looked directly at Daniel. She's still recovering. No raised voices. No sudden movements. If she becomes tired. This conversation ends. Daniel nodded quickly. Of course. His voice sounded different now. Uncertain. Afraid. James opened the door. Morning sunlight spilled through the half-open curtains. Victoria was sitting upright against the hospital bed. She looked pale, thinner, weaker, but her eyes were exactly the same. Calm, observant, steady. Maggie's eyes immediately filled with tears. Oh, sweetheart. Victoria smiled softly. Hi, Maggie. Maggie crossed the room and gently hugged her. Careful of the 4 lines. Careful not to hurt her. I've missed hearing your voice. Victoria smiled. I've missed yours, too. Richard stepped forward next. It's good to have you back. Victoria nodded. Thank you. For believing me before I even had proof. Richard smiled faintly. Your father would have expected nothing less. Finally, Victoria looked at Daniel. Neither spoke. The silence stretched almost 20 seconds. Long enough to become uncomfortable. Long enough for everyone else to understand. This wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people whose lives had ended before either of them had admitted it. Daniel slowly stepped closer. His eyes filled with tears. Victoria. I'm so sorry. She looked at him quietly. For what? The question caught him off guard. What? You said you're sorry. She held his gaze. For which part? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Victoria looked toward Samantha. And you? Samantha immediately began crying. I don't deserve to be here. Victoria answered gently. No, you probably don't. No anger, no shouting. Somehow, that hurt more. Daniel finally found his voice. I made mistakes. Victoria nodded once. You did. I never wanted this. You still did it. I loved you. Victoria looked at him for several seconds, then quietly asked, Did you? Daniel blinked. What? I've been asking myself something for days. Her voice remained calm. I know you cared about me. I know some of what we shared was real. She paused, but somewhere along the way, you stopped protecting me. And started protecting what being with me could give you. Daniel lowered his head. He couldn't deny it. Victoria looked out the hospital window before speaking again. "Do you remember the night you proposed?" Daniel whispered, "Yes. You told me that you wanted to help carry my responsibilities." A faint smile crossed her face. "I believed you." She looked back at him. "But responsibilities aren't something you inherit. They're something you carry. And when they became heavy, you started looking for a way to carry the company instead of the woman." Daniel covered his face with one hand. He was crying openly now. Not because he'd been exposed, because, for the first time, he understood exactly when he'd lost himself. Samantha took one hesitant step forward. "I never stopped loving you as my friend." Victoria looked at her. "I believe that." Samantha looked shocked. "You do?" "Yes." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I also believe jealousy can live beside love. And if you ignore it long enough, it eventually decides which one survives." Samantha broke down completely. "I'm sorry. I'm so—" Victoria gently raised a hand. "You don't need to convince me you're sorry. You need to spend the rest of your life becoming someone who never makes these choices again." Samantha nodded through tears. "I will. I hope you do." Daniel finally looked up. "There has to be something I can say." Victoria shook her head. "No." He stared at her. "No?" She smiled sadly. "For days, I listened. I listened while you comforted people. I listened while you planned board meetings. I listened while you talked about temporary authority. I listened while you said my trust made everything possible." Daniel froze. His eyes widened. Slowly, almost fearfully, he whispered, "You heard that?" Victoria nodded. "I heard all of it." The room became completely still. Daniel stumbled backward until he reached the wall. His entire body seemed to lose its strength. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible." Dr. Whitaker finally spoke. "It wasn't impossible. It was necessary." Daniel looked toward him. "You knew?" James nodded. "So did Richard." Daniel slowly turned toward Maggie. "You knew too?" She quietly answered, "Only near the end." He looked around the room. Everyone except Samantha had known. Everyone. The realization hit harder than any accusation. For the first time in years, Daniel had been the one who didn't know what was happening. Victoria reached beneath her blanket. She slowly removed the engagement ring she had placed back on her finger after the accident to maintain appearances. She held it in her palm for a moment, then extended her hand. Daniel stared at the ring. "I don't want it." Victoria answered softly, "It was never yours." He looked confused. She gently placed it on the bedside table. "It belonged to the future we were supposed to have." Her eyes met his one last time. That future ended long before this conversation. No one spoke. No dramatic music. No shouting. No revenge. Just the quiet ending of something that once felt unbreakable. Richard finally broke the silence. "The legal process will continue." Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. Two hospital security officers stepped into the room. Not to embarrass him, not to force him, simply to accompany him as procedures moved forward. Daniel looked at Victoria one last time. "I hope." His voice cracked. "One day you remember me before I became this person." Victoria looked at him with quiet sadness. "I already do. And that's what makes this so painful." Daniel closed his eyes, then walked out without another word. Samantha remained standing where she was. She looked at Victoria. "I don't expect forgiveness." Victoria nodded. "Then don't ask for it." Samantha quietly whispered, "I'll spend the rest of my life earning the chance to forgive myself." She turned and followed Daniel out. The room fell silent again. Maggie gently took Victoria's hand. Richard stood beside the window. James checked her monitors. For the first time in days, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. And sometimes, honesty is the first real step toward healing. Victoria remained in the hospital for another week, not because she was in danger, because her body had endured far more than anyone outside Dr. Whitaker's team understood. The medication used to maintain the appearance of a medically supervised coma had done exactly what it was supposed to do, but lying motionless for days had left her weak. Even sitting up for long conversations exhausted her. She accepted it. Healing wasn't something she could schedule. The morning after Daniel left the hospital, Sterling Global released a brief public statement. It was only 3 sentences long. Victoria Sterling has regained consciousness and is recovering well. Temporary governance procedures have concluded, and Ms. Sterling will resume her responsibilities after medical clearance. We appreciate the extraordinary support shown by employees, partners, and the public during this difficult time. Nothing more. No mention of Daniel. No mention of investigations. No public accusations. Reporters immediately began asking questions. Sterling Global answered none of them. Victoria insisted on that. The courts exist for facts, not press conferences. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat inside a federal conference room with his attorney. Across the table were representatives from Sterling Global, forensic accountants, and investigators. The evidence was organized into neat binders. There were no dramatic surprises, no hidden recordings, no theatrical confrontations, just documents, electronic access records, governance requests, draft amendments, financial transfers, emails, meeting notes. Every decision Daniel believed had been invisible had quietly left a trail. His attorney closed the final binder, then looked at him. "They don't need you to confess." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know." Several investigations followed. The evidence showed Daniel had attempted to position himself for control if Victoria became permanently incapable of leading Sterling Global. Investigators also discovered that he had concealed conflicts of interest while seeking expanded authority over company affairs. The affair itself wasn't a crime. His conduct surrounding the company was. That distinction mattered. Months later, Daniel accepted responsibility for multiple corporate offenses rather than forcing a lengthy public trial. The legal consequences were substantial: financial penalties, professional restrictions, years of work rebuilding a reputation that might never fully recover. When reporters waited outside the courthouse hoping for a dramatic statement, Daniel simply walked past them. For the first time in years, he had nothing left to perform. Samantha's consequences looked different. No courtroom decided them. Life did. The consulting firm where she worked quietly accepted her resignation. Several longtime friends stopped returning her calls. People who had once admired her began keeping their distance, not because they hated her, because trust, once broken, rarely returns all at once. One afternoon, she packed the last box from her apartment. There wasn't much inside. A few photographs, several books, a faded picture of 2 little girls standing beneath the maple tree at Sterling Manor. Victoria and Samantha. She stared at it for a long time, then carefully placed it inside the box instead of throwing it away. Some memories deserved to hurt. Nearly a month after leaving the hospital, Victoria returned to Sterling Global. She insisted on arriving through the main entrance. No private elevator, no announcement. Employees noticed her almost immediately. The first person to see her was an elderly receptionist named Linda. Her eyes widened. "Miss Sterling." "Oh," Victoria smiled. "It's good to be back." Linda hurried around the desk before stopping herself. "I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm allowed to hug the CEO." Victoria laughed. "I think we'll survive the paperwork." The 2 women embraced. Within minutes, word spread through the building. People weren't gathering because the billionaire CEO had returned. They were gathering because Victoria had. Applause slowly filled the lobby. Not loud, not orchestrated, just sincere. Victoria looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some smiled, some cried. Many had prayed for her every day she was gone. She felt overwhelmed. Richard stepped beside her. "You don't have to make a speech." She nodded gratefully. "I wasn't planning to." Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." For taking care of each other. Nothing more. It was enough. Later that afternoon, The board held its first meeting since her return. Several directors expected Victoria to remove every executive connected to Daniel. Instead, she surprised them. "We're not here to punish people who acted honestly." She looked around the room. "We're here to fix the weaknesses this exposed." Richard smiled quietly. That sounded exactly like the woman he'd worked beside for 20 years. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. By the end, Sterling Global had approved sweeping governance reforms. No future executive would ever have unchecked access to emergency authority. Major decisions would require broader independent oversight. Employee ethics protections would expand. Anonymous reporting channels would receive additional funding. One director leaned back in his chair. "This is the biggest governance reform in company history." Victoria nodded. "It should be." She looked around the room. "If we're unwilling to learn from betrayal." Then, betrayal wins twice. That evening, Victoria returned to Sterling Manor just before sunset. She expected the house to feel different. Instead, it smelled exactly the same. Fresh bread from the kitchen, flowers in the entrance hall, wood polish on the staircase. Home, Maggie met her at the front door. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten where you lived." Victoria laughed. "I almost took a wrong turn. I would have sent a search party." They hugged, longer than either expected. When they finally stepped apart, Maggie looked at her carefully. "You look tired." "I am." "You also look lighter." Victoria smiled. "I think those two things can exist together." Maggie nodded. "I think they can." As they walked toward the kitchen together, Victoria looked around the house that had once felt filled with secrets. Now, for the first time in months, it felt peaceful, not because everything had been repaired, because the lies were finally gone. A week after returning to work, Victoria asked Richard to clear 1 hour on her calendar. No meetings, no investors, no media. Richard looked up from his tablet. "You already have 3 requests from financial networks. They can wait." "What can't?" Victoria smiled. "Someone who's waited 30 years without ever asking for anything." Richard smiled knowingly. "I'll ask Maggie to come by." Maggie arrived at Sterling Global, looking more nervous than she'd been the day Daniel was exposed. She paused outside Victoria's office. "I don't belong in places like this." Richard chuckled. "You've probably earned that office more than most people who sit inside it." Maggie laughed softly. "I doubt Victoria would agree." Richard smiled. "That's because she's Victoria." When Maggie stepped inside, she immediately noticed the office looked almost exactly the way it always had. The framed family photographs hadn't moved. The old grandfather clock still stood beside the bookshelf. Even the slightly crooked painting Daniel had once promised to straighten remained untouched. Victoria noticed Maggie looking at it. "I've decided to leave it." Maggie smiled. "Why?" "It reminds me that not everything has to be perfect to feel like home." They both laughed. The tension disappeared almost instantly. Victoria walked around her desk instead of remaining behind it. She never liked important conversations with furniture between people. She handed Maggie a small wooden box. "I've been trying to find the right way to say thank you." Maggie frowned. "You don't have to thank me." "I do. You saved me." "No," Maggie gently corrected. "You saved yourself." Victoria slowly shook her head. "I couldn't have done it without you." Maggie looked down at the unopened box. "I don't want a reward." "I know. Then what is this?" "A thank you." "They're different." Maggie hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside was an old silver house key mounted on polished walnut. Beneath it was a small engraved plaque. "Sterling Manor. Home is protected by people, not walls." Maggie's eyes immediately filled with tears. Victoria smiled. "My father gave me that key when I turned 18. He said, 'Well, one day you'll learn that the people who protect a home are more valuable than the home itself.'" Victoria gently touched the frame. "I think he would have wanted you to have it." Maggie closed the box almost immediately. "I can't." "You can. It's too valuable." Victoria smiled softly. It already protected the right person. Before Maggie could answer, someone knocked. Richard stepped inside. "Sorry to interrupt." "The board's ready." Victoria nodded. "We'll be there in a minute." He glanced toward Maggie. "I hope she accepted." Maggie smiled through tears. "I'm still trying to argue." Richard laughed. "Good luck." He quietly left. Once the door closed, Maggie looked back at Victoria. "There's something I need to tell you." Victoria listened. "I almost walked away that day." "What day?" "The day I heard them talking. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself maybe I'd misunderstood." She looked down. "I almost convinced myself to stay quiet." Victoria stepped closer. "But you didn't." "No." Maggie smiled sadly. "I remembered something." "What?" "The day my husband got sick. 2 years earlier, Maggie's husband, Harold, collapsed while repairing a greenhouse on the estate. The diagnosis came quickly, a rare heart condition. The surgery had to happen immediately. The cost was impossible. Maggie had already decided to sell her small house. Even then, impossible. Maggie had already decided to sell her small house. Even then, it wouldn't have been enough. 2 days later, the hospital administrator called. "The balance has been paid." Maggie assumed there had been a mistake. "There must be another Harold Bennett." "There isn't." "Who paid it?" "I'm sorry." The donor asked to remain anonymous. For years, Maggie never discovered who had saved her husband's life, until one afternoon, nearly a decade later, she accidentally found an old accounting file while organizing estate records. A single handwritten note rested inside. "Employee Family Emergency Assistance approved by Victoria Sterling." No announcement, no recognition, no publicity. Victoria had never even mentioned it. Maggie looked at Victoria now. "You were only 22. You'd just buried your parents. And somehow, you were still taking care of other people." Victoria smiled gently. "I had help." "No." Maggie shook her head. "You had character." She reached out and took Victoria's hands. "When I heard Daniel and Samantha, I didn't help you because you were my employer. I helped you because long before that day, you'd already become family." Neither woman said another word. They didn't need to. Some gratitude is too deep for conversation. A month later, Sterling Global hosted its annual employee appreciation gathering. Unlike previous years, Victoria insisted the event remain simple. No expensive decorations, no celebrity guests, just employees and their families. Near the end of the afternoon, she walked onto the small stage. She rarely enjoyed public speaking. This day wasn't about speeches. "I'll keep this short." The crowd laughed. "You've all heard that before." More laughter followed. Then her expression softened. "A few months ago, I learned something. No company succeeds because of one leader. It succeeds because ordinary people choose integrity when no one's watching." She paused. "Today, I'd like you to meet someone who reminded me what that looks like." She turned toward the front row. Maggie, the elderly housekeeper, looked genuinely confused. "Me?" Victoria smiled. "Yes." Employees applauded as Maggie slowly walked to the stage. She looked embarrassed. "I didn't prepare anything." "You don't have to." Victoria turned back toward the audience. "For 30 years, Maggie has cared for this family. When it mattered most, she protected something money never could. Our values." The applause grew louder. Not because Maggie had exposed Daniel. Most employees didn't know those details. They applauded because every person in the company knew Maggie. She remembered birthdays, brought soup when someone was sick, asked about grandchildren. She represented everything Victoria wanted Sterling Global to become. Victoria handed Maggie a folder. Inside was the charter for a new initiative, the Maggie Bennett Employee Integrity and Family Support Foundation. The program would provide emergency financial assistance, confidential counseling, legal support, and protection for employees who chose to report misconduct or who faced unexpected family crises. Maggie stared at the document. "You named it after me?" Victoria smiled. "No, I named it after courage. You simply happened to show everyone what it looked like." The room rose to its feet, not because of wealth, not because of power, because they had just watched two women honor something far rarer: quiet integrity. And in that standing ovation, Victoria realized something that no boardroom, balance sheet, or billion-dollar company could ever teach. The strongest foundation any organization can build is trust earned one person at a time. 6 months later, Sterling Manor sounded like itself again, not because every painful memory had disappeared, because new memories had finally begun replacing them. The library once again filled with quiet conversations. The gardens were alive with weekend tours for local school children. The kitchen echoed with Maggie reminding everyone that homemade pie solved more problems than most meetings. Life hadn't returned to what it was. It had become something new, something wiser. On a crisp October morning, Victoria walked the grounds before leaving for work. She always started near the old oak tree, the same tree where Daniel had proposed. For weeks after everything ended, she'd avoided it. Now she stopped there by choice, not because it reminded her of betrayal, because it reminded her that beautiful memories and painful ones can exist in the same place. One doesn't erase the other. She rested her hand against the rough bark, then quietly smiled. Some chapters weren't meant to be forgotten, only finished. As she continued walking, employees preparing the gardens waved. "Morning, Miss Sterling." She laughed. "How many times do I have to say it's Victoria?" One of the gardeners grinned. "When you stop signing our paychecks." Everyone laughed. Moments like that meant more to her now than headlines ever could. Later that morning, Richard stepped into her office carrying a thin folder. "I thought you'd want to see this." Victoria looked up. "What is it?" "The final report." She opened it. Every legal matter connected to Daniel had officially been resolved. Every governance reform had been implemented. Every recommendation approved. She closed the folder. "So," Richard smiled. "So, ooh, we're finished." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "I've been waiting months to hear those words." Richard hesitated before leaving. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret not fighting harder in public?" She knew what he meant. She could have given interviews, written a book, turned Daniel into the headline of every business network in America. Instead, she had stayed silent. Victoria shook her head. "No." "Why?" "Because justice and humiliation aren't the same thing." Richard smiled. "Your father would have said exactly that." "I know," she smiled back. "I finally understand why." That afternoon, Victoria received an unexpected letter. There was no return address. Inside was a single handwritten page. "Victoria, I don't expect a reply. I only wanted you to know that I found work at a community outreach center. Nobody there knows who I used to be, and for the first time in years, I'm learning how to be useful instead of impressive. Every day I remember the little girl who shared her lunch with me, defended me when other kids laughed, and never once made me feel less than her friend. Somewhere along the way, I became so busy comparing my life to yours that I forgot to become the person you believed I already was. I'm trying now. Thank you for being a better friend than I deserved. Samantha." Victoria read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. She didn't write back, not because she hated Samantha, because some journeys had to be walked alone. She silently hoped Samantha kept walking. That evening, Sterling Global hosted a scholarship dinner for employees' children. Victoria insisted on greeting every student personally. One nervous teenage boy approached her. "Miss Victoria." She smiled. "Which one are we going with?" He laughed. "Victoria, better." He looked down at the acceptance letter in his hands. "My mom works in shipping." "I know." "You do?" "Angela, night shift. She makes the best peanut butter cookies at Christmas." The teenager stared in disbelief. "You know my mom?" Victoria smiled. "I know she works harder than most executives." He laughed. "She'll never believe you remembered." Tell her I expect cookies this year." "I will." As he walked away, Richard quietly said, "You remember thousands of names." Victoria shrugged. "People remember how you make them feel." I tried to return the favor. After the event ended, Maggie joined Victoria on the front steps of Sterling Manor. The sun had begun to set. The sky glowed orange behind the maple trees. For a while, they simply watched the leaves drift across the lawn. Finally, Maggie asked, "What have you learned from all this?" Victoria thought about the question, long enough that Maggie wondered if she'd answer at all. Then she quietly said, "I used to believe kindness was enough." Maggie nodded. "And now?" "I think kindness needs wisdom." She smiled softly. "Otherwise, generous people become easy targets." Maggie looked at her carefully. "You still trust people?" "I do. Doesn't that scare you?" Victoria laughed. "Every day. But I'd rather learn to trust wisely than spend the rest of my life trusting no one." As darkness settled over Sterling Manor, employees leaving for the evening waved goodbye. "Good night, Victoria." "See you tomorrow." "Drive safely." She answered every one of them. Not because she was the CEO, because she genuinely cared. Maggie watched quietly before smiling to herself. Years earlier, she'd believed she'd spent her life protecting Sterling Manor. Now she realized something different. The house had never been the heart of the estate. Victoria was, and as long as she remained the kind of leader who valued people above power, Sterling Manor would always be more than a mansion. It would remain a home. Victoria stood and looked one last time across the grounds her parents had loved. The pain hadn't disappeared. It never completely would, but it no longer controlled her. Daniel had taught her that love without integrity eventually collapses. Samantha had taught her that comparison can quietly destroy even the oldest friendships. Maggie had reminded her that loyalty can't be purchased. Richard had shown her that wisdom often speaks the most softly, and Dr. Whitaker had proven that courage sometimes looks like simply holding still until the truth has time to reveal itself. She smiled, not because life had been fair, because it had been honest. Then she walked toward the front door of Sterling Manor. Employees continued their work. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. Somewhere inside, Maggie was probably insisting that everyone stay for dessert. Victoria laughed to herself. Home didn't feel perfect anymore. It felt real. And after everything she'd survived, she realized that was far more valuable. Because wealth can attract people who admire what you have, but only character reveals the people who truly love who you are. And in the end, that became the greatest inheritance Victoria Sterling ever received.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.